Joan Wills established the Center for Workforce Development inside the Institute for Educational Leadership. She's currently Senior Policy Fellow with the Institute. She's also working with the National Collaboration on Workforce Development and for Disability and Youth. She has written many reports, such as a comprehensive career planning and its role in a competitive global economy, mentoring strategies to support expansion of diversity in the workforce. She has preparing all youth for academic and career readiness, implications for high school policy and practice. She has also been a leading PI on a project looking at nationally how individualized learning plans are kind of sweeping across different state initiatives and trying to put together resources to support schools as well as states in understanding the policies as well as the practices. So she is one who's read our work, knows our work, and is looking forward, I think, in the future for ways that our work can more effectively make our case for what she knows is the most important thing going, which is how do we help youth as well as adults have a clear understanding of their pathway in life and the skills and competencies to navigate through the world of work. So without further ado, then I'd like to ask Joan to come up. Thank you.
What Scott didn't tell you is I edit him a lot. I want to thank you for this opportunity. And one, to say, in the program, it said Curtis Richards would be here. Well, he's not. He has taken over the position of running the center at the Institute for Educational Leadership as I am in the process of fading out. I am semi-retired at this point and enjoying grandchildren a whole lot. A little bit more in my background, and I normally don't tell this story, but seems to fit with this audience. I came out of the war on poverty. Remember in the 1960s when we were going to solve everything in 5 years and take care of all the poverty problems at the local level, and then ended up going to work for 2 state governments in political appointment positions, and then at the National Governors Association running their Center for Policy Research for a number of years. When I was at NGA, there was something called NOIC and SOIC, that in fact we were very much involved in supporting and pushing the continuation and the expansion of that network that for me was one of the best examples of intergovernmental relationships that we have in the I have seen in the United States, and unfortunately know why it was eliminated. And we are suffering because of that yet today. But I think we can get some lessons if we energize ourselves to think about them. I've been a lobbyist for education and training in the halls of Congress for a point in my life. And that was when we had a much more civil society. And we worked together. We don't do that now. And as I was sitting there listening to the great and wonderful things that are going on in European Union, and as Ramona told me last night, you can't say harmonization. We can't say socialization. We can't say a social society because it's going to prove that we're all socialists now. But there are some really, as you were talking, the lessons are so similar in terms of how it is we need to organize and utilize the role and responsibilities of different parts, different networks in our countries. Here we have to think 50 states. And we haven't done that very well in some years in terms of how to build that system. But more importantly, and I deliberately used the question, professional societies. What are the responsibilities of the professional societies? I think today, can we really support and take as a pledge to develop the public career development systems? I use those words quite deliberately, public career development systems. What are the key leverage points of societies? These are things I want you to think about in the next day and a half. What should be included in an agenda? What do I hit? Why do we need this conversation? It was nice that you gave us credit that the U.S. really made a lot of contributions. That's not the case today. It's just simply not. We've really fallen so far behind. The decline's gone over for the last 30 plus years, maybe even a little bit longer. Our workforce development systems under the Workforce Investment Act and indeed other pieces of legislation are the most poorly funded they've ever been in the last 30 years. They are not considered a part of our national economic development agenda, not in Washington, D.C. anymore. And we have this huge waste of personal, family, and public dollars spent on poorly focused career preparation programs. Talking about money spent and money wasted in terms of student loans, we're in serious trouble. It was probably very arrogant of me to do this one, but a quick bit of history. We were the leader. When you look across the board in terms of federal government's responsibilities to supporting anything inside the education system, interestingly enough, career guidance was one of the earliest and one of the strongest over 100 years ago. Frank Parsons, influence, it's incredible, but it's not the case any longer. While we passed the Smith-Hughes Act, vocational education, in 1917, is still there today, but the role of career guidance within that piece of legislation, as we know it today, is Perkins 3 or 4, can't remember, is much weakened. I'll give you some statistics in a couple of minutes. Maybe it was our heyday when we had a title within the National Defense Education Act referencing career guidance, of which the professional societies was an outgrowth of that. We moved to equity and access in the 1960s. We created a career guidance and counseling office inside the old Office of Education. Didn't last, unfortunately. Then we had the 70s with the NOIC-SOIC. And that's when I got to DC. Found that, in fact, it was really quite a marvelous educational network. It helped train people. It helped teach me when I was back running a state office in the state of Illinois. I had the pleasure of hiring the NOIC and having housed in my office then. And it was the one thing that I could get the people from 5 different state agencies to come together and talk about. Think about how powerful that was. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, our silence is deafening. We're going to have to start making noises. Let me give this example. This was in one of those studies I was asked papers I was asked to write where I found this statistic, and I checked it out, and it was for real. Total outlay out of the Perkins money, which has always been the largest source of funding for vocational guidance, we were spending $10 million, or 5 cents, for the 60 million people that needed the support. Does that tell us we have a cost problem or a support problem? And then in 2006, they did not even appropriate funds for the 10 million. And we all know it's gotten worse. Another example comes out of the No Child Left Behind legislation. And you have to ask yourself, why is career guidance housed in the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools? And why is it that they have this strange part of the legislation that focuses on the money going to elementary? And I'm not opposed to money going into the elementary schools, quite to the contrary. But through a convoluted and complex funding formula, the federal government had to spend at least $40 million before even middle schools and secondary schools would become eligible. Convoluted? In the WIA legislation, we don't need to go into all the details, but at least there's some references in there about labor market information, career guidance, the need for collaboration between the State Department of Education and the State Department of Labor to support labor market information and career information systems. And we still do have some very good online career information systems. The other title is Title IV of the Workforce Investment Act. And that funds the vocational rehabilitation system for those persons with disabilities. They don't often like to claim that they're part of the workforce development system. They are. They, by the way, provide a very interesting lesson, I think, out of the vocational rehabilitation system that I think we all need to listen to and think about. It was the consumers of vocational rehabilitation legislation, those persons with disabilities, that were very frustrated with the quality of vocational guidance and support services from vocational rehabilitation, that acted up and acted out and got passed into the Title IV of that legislation, the concept of informed choice, consumer responsibilities for making their own career choices. And that is embedded in Title IV of WIA, but the responsibilities for people to make their own career management decisions are not embedded anyplace else in WIA. So we can, in fact, learn. We can come together. We haven't yet. One of the realities of our current public accountability system is that we have nothing that measures as a core service. And if you can't measure it in our accountability system, you don't get the money, or even recognize the importance of that it needs to be defined in law. Because when you look at the current WIA law, when you look at all of the federal pieces of legislation, there are no definitions of career guidance and counseling. In fact, I have been told by staff who used to work on the Hill that was a very deliberate decision. They didn't want to be bothered with the messiness and the disagreements coming out of the profession. Now I want to go back and recognize the power of that OECD work, that original work. It should make us feel perhaps comfortable at one level that we're not alone, that other states, other nations have had trouble. And I've done a fair amount of work with OECD over the years, and I was always struck with how valuable and how different that OECD study was around career guidance and counseling, because it's one of the few documents, I think they're now emulating that in other areas, much more so than they have in the past. What they found when they, along with the World Bank and other ministries, other international organizations, they found that there basically was no voice in the policy-making processes across the world. So it reinforces and tells how powerful and how important that which is going on in the EU now is, unless you have the structures and the systems, you're in trouble. They also found that there were some really still decent things going on out there in the world that we needed to pay attention to. They identified some really very important areas to think about. And I'm putting these up because, again, as you talk in the next day and a half, I hope there'll be some attention given to these. Limited access to services, particularly for adults, and that's very true in the United States. Failure to develop the individual career management skills as a driver of the way we organize our services, and inadequate training and qualifications for the providers of the services. They identified two key challenges: cost-effective ways to expand citizens' access, and need to move from approach emphasizing assistance to immediate occupational services, and develop that ability. Go into a one-stop center anywhere in the United States and see if you can find that as a driver of the way services are delivered. I don't think so. U.S. is a nation that helped lead the way, no more. I went back. OECD, some lessons, basically said focus yet connect. You need to focus on different categories of populations. They identified youth in public and initial preparation in schools, youth at risk, students in post-secondary education. You've already talked about it in terms of what's going on in the European Union, unemployed adults, other disadvantaged groups such as immigrants, and that happens to be a particular issue for us. But they also said that you have to focus, connect yet focus on system support. And from my personal perspective, I think that's where we in the United States have fallen down in the last few years in a significant way. We need to think about what it means to train the personnel, pre-service and in service. We need to think hard about how to organize the structures and therefore the pieces of legislation for funding each of the different populations, because they can, and in fact, in our situation, will, I'm sure, come from different sources of monies. what one does for the initial preparation is very, very fundamentally different than the sources of funds for others. But we can have a common framework. I work at a place called the Institute for Educational Leadership. And that was created almost 50 years ago now by Harold Howe, who was at the Ford Foundation, and some of you may remember was LBJ's head of the Office of Education many years ago. And he had this Doc Howe, who was the chair of our board for years and years, thought we had a lot of educators in the United States, but we didn't have people who understood how to create education policy. Well, maybe what we need to do is to create a leadership development, and so he funded a leadership development system, happened to be in service, and it was doing quite well until Ronald Reagan decided we didn't need a Department of Education. We lost some funding. Big time, but we do need to think about how to pay attention to the leaders and that leadership development role. Probably most can be done in an in-service situation, not in the pre-service. And most importantly, I happen to think, is to develop methods for assessing effectiveness and embed it in the public laws. We can do it, and a lot of this, in fact, comes from the lessons we learned out of the NOIC-SOIC system that was valuable but not broad enough. We can build transparent and highly accessible systems. We can promote user-friendly, flexible service delivery systems, ensure integration. And we have a responsibility to ensure that integration between the educational, occupational, and labor market information systems. OECD had another framework, another part of the framework, I should say. Access to individual guidance by appropriately qualified practitioners for those who need such help. Access to services that are independent of the interest of the particular institutions or enterprises. I think that happens to be very important. And some processes to stimulate regular review and involvement of all the stakeholders. And one of the things that strikes me is how difficult it is for us when we're talking about career guidance and counseling is the stakeholders are very wide, not necessarily always very deep in terms of institutions, but it's hard to figure out who needs to be sitting at the table and where, which table and where. But we know enough to be able to do it. It's just a messy process. So I think there are some policy targets for societies along with their sister organizations, and I wish I'd thought more about saying something about this is in the overview. The membership organizations of practitioners, such as the National Association of Career and Technical Education, state directors, those that are involved out in the field that are membership associations, not the professional, they don't see themselves and talk about themselves as a professional society. They're there by virtue of their positions. We need to think about who they need to be in there. I think you can do, and indeed have done, a great deal in terms of developing and documenting what kinds of tools work for different populations. I'm so glad to hear a professor from a university say we need to move beyond the students in the colleges. It used to, it still frustrates me today when I'm trying to get some relevant research and can't really just use students from colleges as your example all the time. We need to think very, very deeply about the system support, about how to address issues such as career information, training, funding, coordination, absolutely essential issue, strategic leadership, quality assurances, etc. How would I rank the state of affairs? I moved it up from a D in my first draft to a C minus. Why did it happen? Where do we need to focus? My answer really is, at this point, we need to spend some time, not to the exclusion of the target populations, but we really must spend some time thinking about the system support for addressing the issues. That's where we've lost ground. That's why Congress, they got no noise from the field when we were only spending 5 cents on every individual. So I think some simple exercises might be simple but not easy to do. Which other professional societies do you need to link with? Which other organizations need to be on the list? How do you frame an action agenda? You can use the updated EU action agenda from the OECD one. I didn't put EU down because we don't even like to recognize that OECD might have something of value to say in the United States, but we're more inclined to use that than we are EU at this point. That's just a political reality. Now, you can slip a lot of the stuff in, but don't walk around and say, let's become another EU. It won't work here. I hope I'm not being too negative. And I've been seriously concerned about that. But we've got a lot of examples of good practice. We don't lack good practice examples in the United States. We lack clarity of purpose, sufficient scale, adequate human resources and fiscal resources. Coordination across laws. There's only about 5, depending on how you want to count them, there are really about 5 key pieces of federal legislation. And then every state has their own different ones. There's some secondary pieces of proposed legislation at the federal level that we probably need to also pay attention to, because there's growth in proposed legislation talking about sectorial policies. There's growth in recognizing that we need to develop different metrics to promote an analysis of how systems are working, that we cannot continue to work only on outcomes. We have to have metrics that support an analysis of what kinds of strategies work inside systems. And for me, where would one look except to the people who are sitting in this room and other rooms like this to help us develop those metrics? I am absolutely delighted to hear that maybe some of the work needs to be those longitudinal studies. I didn't see how much I don't know. I didn't know that it was a killer for the person to promote longitudinal studies, because I think they're absolutely essential and need to be launched as quickly as possible. And we do have to do the gold standard research. We do have to do the clinical trials. No way out of it. And interestingly enough, there are some really wonderful research organizations that I think you could partner with. The Manpower Development Research Corporation out of New York, and public-private ventures, etc., of who get the money to do a lot of the evaluations of our programs, and they never, ever include in their studies what to do about and how to assess career guidance structures and where it works. So we can make music if we figure out who needs to be sitting in the same room. So you got to identify those partners first. And I would strongly urge you, partly because I get asked to write synthesis studies for the federal government of what we know and don't know on different topics. And I thought it was going to be easy to write the story about career guidance back about 4 years ago. And it was very hard to do because it was very hard to find the synthesized research. I could find bits and pieces, but I couldn't pull it up to add, for it to add up. That's part of our problem. We've got to figure out how to add that research base adds up from the perspective of how it supports systems as well as individuals. And then the final thing that I think you have to think about is how do you prepare an aggressive agenda? Silence that is deafening assures death of the services. And we are in a position of silence that is deafening. This past week, I had been waiting with hope. The Employment and Training Administration of the Department of Labor has this congressional responsibility to issue once every 5 years a research agenda. Now we have some time here. We're going to have to act quickly, but we do have some time. We're coming up to the end of the current 5-year plan in the year 2012. They have to present once every 2 years a synthesis of what they want to do in terms of research. And there was an advisory group that had developed a thorough analysis, basically for this administration, of the strengths and weaknesses of the research agenda, and for the first time recognized the importance of collaborating across different federal agencies, need to improve and make much more transparent the findings of the different agendas, because there's been 3 or 4 reports from the Government Accountability Office criticizing the lack of transparency and the lack of quality and the lack of research as it relates to career development in the United States. That was all in the last decade. This past week, the Department of Labor did issue their current research agenda. And I was looking through it before I came up here. I just wanted to pound the table. Career guidance and career development were not even, didn't exist, and did not exist. And then I decided, well, Joan, you know enough. They respond to noise, just like everybody else does. Nobody's saying here's something we need to do from the field. So we need to regenerate and rethink about, in the context of this larger agenda, what it is we learn from our NOIC and SOIC and our other past histories, and come up with an aggressive research agenda. And I think we've got an example. While it was rather painful, the very fact that when No Child Left Behind was passed, they did create the Institute for Education Sciences, IES. It is getting good reviews in many places. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I think we could, and in fact, the advisory panel that was advising the Department of Labor about what it is they should be doing, and I do know that they are thinking about maybe in the reauthorization of WIA, saying we need to create a workforce development institute of sciences that is broadly based, that addresses the different things that are needed, as was pointed out, in terms of our income support systems, our welfare systems, our education systems, and our labor market information, that we can, in fact, create just one part of the agenda, and I would hope that you all think hard about this one, how to create a workforce institute, development institute, thinking about the different centers. I've spent some time thinking about that. You don't have to take my list, and I deliberately did not put up here my list. But let me run through some things. First one is basic research that includes longitudinal studies. It's what we don't know that we need to know from longitudinal studies is hurting us. A Center for the Study of the Needs of Industry Sectors. A Center for the Study and Support of Skilled Workforce. These are all things that are part of vocational psychology. And then a Center for Career Development and Guidance. And a Center for Program and Systems Improvement and Accountability. And I wasn't even looking at the EU framework when I wrote those. But it is just kind of common sense. Think through what you would like to advocate and then find partners to advocate that. Perhaps we should be grateful that the Workforce Investment Act has still not been reauthorized, and I'm sure will not be reauthorized until the next Congress. So you can begin to think about how to create some noise. And there's some other kinds of things that can happen. It's not hard to focus if you start thinking about the different target populations, start thinking about who you know needs to be at that table, and then what are some tools to get us there. It would be wonderful if we saw some evidence of some advocacy for some longitudinal work as a part of that agenda, because I don't know how else we can begin to get some baseline materials. And yes, Scott, we do need some gold standard research case studies. That's, I hope I have fulfilled the challenge of what it is you can do and help launch, because something must be done.